The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine grounds of Colegio Westview as João Martinez stood at its wrought iron gates, his new leather shoes pinching slightly at the toes. The prestigious school's neoclassical architecture loomed before him, its cream-colored walls and elegant columns a stark contrast to the modest public school he'd attended until now. His mother had spent months securing his placement here, working extra shifts at the hospital where she served as head of neurosurgery to ensure he could have the best education possible. João adjusted his crisp navy blazer, the school's crest gleaming gold against the dark fabric. The weight of the new uniform felt foreign on his shoulders, much like the weight of expectations he carried. Through the gates, students streamed past in identical uniforms, their conversations a gentle murmur in the morning air. Yet even in identical clothing, João couldn't help but notice the subtle differences. Their watches that cost more than his mother's monthly rent, their casual mentions of summer homes and international vacations. As he made his way through the manicured gardens, past carefully tended rose bushes and geometric topiary, João observed the social choreography playing out around him. Groups of students moved with the easy familiarity of those who'd known each other since kindergarten, their laughter echoing across the courtyard. Some cast curious glances his way, their eyes lingering a moment too long before turning back to their conversations. Others didn't look at all, their studied indifference perhaps more telling than open scrutiny. The halls of Colegio Westview smelled of lemon polish and history, the wooden panels along the walls bearing the names of distinguished alumni who'd gone on to become senators, CEOs, and international diplomats. João's footsteps echoed against the marble floors as he searched for room 214, where his new class awaited. The schedule in his hand had already been memorized, but he checked it again, a nervous habit that provided small comfort in this unfamiliar territory. When he finally found the right classroom, Professor Martins was already standing at the front, her steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched her expression. She paused mid-sentence as João entered, her eyes narrowing slightly as they swept over him. The other students turned in their seats, 20 pairs of eyes examining the newcomer with varying degrees of interest and judgment. "You must be João Martinez," Professor Martins said, her tone carrying a note of something João couldn't quite identify. Perhaps disappointment, perhaps displeasure. "You're late." João checked his watch. He was actually 3 minutes early, but he knew better than to argue. "I apologize, Professora. It's my first day, and I was having trouble finding the room." "Take a seat," she replied curtly, gesturing to an empty desk in the back corner. "Try to avoid disrupting the class in the future." As João made his way to the indicated seat, he could feel the weight of his classmates' stares. Someone snickered softly, quickly stifled. He kept his head high, remembering his mother's words that morning. "You belong there as much as anyone else, meu filho. Never let anyone make you feel otherwise." The morning proceeded with a series of subtle indignities. When João raised his hand to answer a question about cellular biology, his favorite subject, Professor Martins's gaze swept past him as if he were invisible. When he finally spoke up during a group discussion, she cut him off mid-sentence to call on Victoria Almeida, whose father owned the largest bank in the city. By lunchtime, João had learned the unwritten rules of Colegio Westview. Success here wasn't just about academic achievement. It was about belonging to the right families, speaking with the right accent, carrying yourself with a particular air of inherited privilege. The cafeteria was a perfect microcosm of TH's social hierarchy, with students automatically sorting themselves into clearly defined groups. João found an empty table near the window, unpacking the lunch his mother had carefully prepared that morning. The aroma of her homemade feijoada drew a few curious glances, but no one approached. He ate quietly, watching the social dynamics play out around him, feeling like an anthropologist observing a foreign culture. The afternoon brought more challenges. During Portuguese literature, Professor Martins asked the class to analyze a passage from Dom Casmurro. João, who had read the book twice over the summer, offered an interpretation about the narrator's unreliability and its connection to social class in 19th century Brazil. The professor's response was immediate and cutting. "That's a rather simplistic analysis, Mr. Martinez," she said, her lips curling slightly. Perhaps in your previous school, such surface-level observations were acceptable, but here at Collegio Westview, we expect a more sophisticated understanding of the classics. The dismissal stung, but it was the knowing looks exchanged between his classmates that truly hurt. João felt his cheeks burn as Professor Martins turned to Lucas Ferreira, whose interpretation, remarkably similar to João's own, was met with effusive praise. As the days passed, a pattern emerged. Professor Martins's treatment of João moved beyond mere oversight into something more deliberate. She seemed to take particular pleasure in highlighting what she perceived as his inadequacies, using every opportunity to remind him, and by extension his classmates, that he didn't quite measure up to Collegio Westview's standards. The breaking point came during a practical demonstration in biology class. Professor Martins had set up an experiment involving microscope work, something João had extensive experience with thanks to countless hours spent in his mother's lab. When it came time to choose a student to demonstrate the proper technique to the class, she called João forward with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Martinez, since you seem so eager to prove yourself, perhaps you'd like to show us the correct way to prepare a slide for microscopic examination?" João approached the front of the class, aware of the expectant silence. He knew this was a test, one designed for him to fail. The microscope before him was a top-of-the-line model, similar to those in his mother's lab. With steady hands, he began the procedure, carefully preparing the specimen according to protocol. Just as he was about to place the cover slip, Professor Martins bumped the table, a subtle movement that appeared accidental to everyone except João. The slide slipped slightly, causing the specimen to smear. A few students giggled. "Oh dear." Professor Martins's voice dripped with false concern. "It seems Mr. Martinez isn't quite ready for our level of equipment. In the future, perhaps you should practice more before attempting to demonstrate to the class. We wouldn't want to waste any more valuable specimens, would we?" The humiliation was complete. João returned to his seat, his face burning, as Professor Martins called Victoria forward to show us how it's properly done. The rest of the class passed in a blur, with João fighting back tears of frustration and anger. That afternoon, as he gathered his books to leave, João overheard two of his classmates whispering near the door. "Did you see his face when he messed up the slide? What do they expect? It's not like he's really Westview material. My father says the school's only letting people like him in now because of some new diversity initiative." João clutched his books tighter and hurried past them, their words echoing in his head. Outside, the same beautiful campus that had filled him with hope that morning now seemed to mock him with its perfection. The carefully manicured gardens and elegant architecture no longer represented opportunity. They were just another reminder of how far he had to go to be accepted. As he waited for his bus at the school gates, João watched his classmates being picked up in luxury cars, their days of humiliation and isolation already forgotten as they chatted about weekend plans and upcoming social events. He thought about his mother, working late at the hospital again, sacrificing so much to give him this opportunity. How could he tell her that the dream she'd worked so hard to achieve for him had become a nightmare? The bus ride home was long, giving João plenty of time to compose himself. He couldn't let his mother see how much he was struggling. She had enough to worry about, and he knew how much it would hurt her to learn that her son was being treated this way. Instead, he would have to find a way to endure, to prove Professor Martins and everyone else wrong. But as the bus wound its way through the city's increasingly modest neighborhoods, João couldn't help but wonder if some battles were impossible to win. The city lights began to flicker on as João's bus wound through the quieter streets of his neighborhood. Each turn brought him further from the manicured lawns of Collegio Westview and closer to the familiar comfort of home. Yet the knot in his stomach only grew tighter. The weight of the day's humiliation still pressed heavily on his shoulders, making even the simple act of climbing the stairs to their apartment feel like scaling a mountain. Their building wasn't fancy, no doorman, no marble lobby, but it was well-maintained, with pots of his mother's carefully tended herbs lining the communal hallway. The scent of oregano and basil usually brought him comfort, but today it only reminded him of the pristine rose gardens at school, another world he couldn't quite belong to. Joao unlocked the door to find the apartment empty, as expected. His mother's shift wouldn't end for several more hours. The silence felt both comforting and accusatory. No one to question his red-rimmed eyes or the slight tremor in his hands, but also no one to offer comfort. He moved through their modest home on autopilot, dropping his heavy backpack by his desk and changing out of the uniform that now felt like a costume in a play where he'd been woefully miscast. The bathroom mirror reflected a face he barely recognized, darker circles under his eyes than he'd noticed that morning, a tightness around his mouth that hadn't been there weeks ago when he'd first received his acceptance letter. Joao splashed cold water on his face, trying to wash away the memory of Professor Martin's smirk as she'd watched him fumble with the microscope slide. In the kitchen, he found a note from his mother propped against a covered plate of pão de queijo. Lanche de tard, meu amor. Heat them up for 2 minutes. Love you, May. The sight of her familiar handwriting, with its elegant loops and careful dots over the eyes, nearly undid him. How many early mornings had she spent preparing these small comforts, making sure he never went hungry even when her own schedule was crushing? Joao couldn't bring himself to eat. Instead, he sat at his desk and pulled out his biology textbook, determined to master every detail, every procedure, every possible question Professor Martins might throw at him. The words swam before his eyes as exhaustion set in, but he forced himself to continue. He couldn't give her another opportunity to humiliate him, to prove her unspoken belief that he didn't deserve his place at Collegio Westview. Hours passed, marked only by the steady tick of the clock and the occasional distant sound of traffic. Joao worked through problem sets, wrote and rewrote notes, and practiced drawing cellular diagrams until his hand cramped. When he finally looked up, the sky outside his window had grown dark, and his mother's key was turning in the lock. Maria Martinez entered their apartment with the quiet efficiency of someone used to moving through hospital corridors. At all hours, her surgeon's hands, still elegant despite years of scrubbing, carefully placed her keys in the ceramic bowl by the door, a piece Joao had made in art class years ago. She was still wearing her scrubs under her coat, her dark hair escaping from its neat bun, but her eyes were alert as they found her son. João, why are you still up, meu filho? It's nearly midnight. She crossed the room to where he sat, her brow furrowing as she took in the scattered textbooks and endless pages of notes. Have you eaten? I'm just finishing some homework, Joao mumbled, unable to meet her gaze. I had a snack earlier. Maria's hand, gentle despite its surgical precision, lifted his chin. Her dark eyes, so like his own, searched his face with the same attention she gave to examining brain scans. Joao, something's wrong. Talk to me. The concern in her voice threatened to crack the careful walls he'd built around his pain. It's nothing, May. Just adjusting to the new school. The work is challenging. The work? Or something else? Maria pulled up a chair beside him, close enough that he could smell the familiar mix of hospital antiseptic and her jasmine perfume. I've noticed you haven't been sleeping well. You barely touch your breakfast. And now I find you studying at midnight when you should be resting. Joao stared at his notes, the carefully drawn diagrams blurring as tears threatened to fall. I just need to work harder. I need to prove I belong there. Belong? Maria's voice sharpened slightly. Joao, look at me. What's happening at that school? The dam broke. Words poured out of Joao in a rush. The subtle exclusions, the pointed ignoring of his raised hand, the whispered comments from classmates, and finally, the humiliation in biology class. As he spoke, he could feel his mother growing very still beside him, the way she did when preparing for a particularly difficult surgery. And Professor Martin, she made it look like an accident, but she bumped the table on purpose. She wanted me to fail, May. She wanted everyone to see that I don't belong there, that I'm not good enough for Collegio Westview. Maria's hand found his, squeezing gently. When she spoke, her voice was calm, but Joao recognized the steel beneath it, the same tone she used when facing hospital administrators who questioned her judgment. You are more than good enough, meu filho. You earned your place there. No one, especially not some prejudiced teacher, can take that away from you. She stood, pacing the small room with controlled energy. Tomorrow, I'm making some calls. This ends now. My... Joao protested, panic rising in his throat. Please, it will only make things worse. They'll say I can't handle it, that I need my mother to fight my battles. Maria stopped pacing, turning to face him with an expression he'd never seen before, a mixture of fierce love and barely contained fury. This isn't just about you anymore, Joao. What about the next student? The next child who comes to that school hoping for an education and finds only prejudice? No. Some battles need to be fought, not just for ourselves, but for others who might follow. She pulled out her phone, fingers moving swiftly over the screen. I'm texting Ana. Joao recognized the name. Ana Rodriguez, his mother's friend from university days, now a prominent civil rights lawyer. They'd had dinner with her just last month, and she'd entertained Joao with stories about her recent cases, her eyes sparking with passion as she described fighting for justice in courtrooms across the city. Ana will know how to handle this properly, Maria continued, her thumbs flying over the keyboard. We'll need documentation, witnesses. Has anyone else noticed how Professor Martins treats you? Other students, perhaps? Joao thought about the sympathetic glances some classmates had given him, the way a few had lingered after class as if wanting to speak, but never quite finding the courage. I don't know. Nobody really talks to me. Maria's phone buzzed with Anna's reply. As she read it, a small, determined smile crossed her face. Ana can meet us for breakfast tomorrow. She says she's been hearing rumors about similar incidents at Colegio Westview. We're not the first, meu filho, but we might be the ones to make sure we're the last. Joao watched his mother transform before his eyes from a tired surgeon at the end of a long shift to a warrior preparing for battle. Her spine straightened, her shoulders squared, and her eyes took on the focused intensity he'd sometimes glimpsed when she discussed particularly challenging cases with her colleagues. But first, she said, her voice softening as she turned back to him, you need to sleep. Real sleep. Not this studying until midnight. You have nothing to prove to anyone, Joao. Your worth isn't determined by how well you can handle their prejudice. As Maria gathered his books and notes, stacking them neatly for the morning, Joao felt something shift inside him. The shame and isolation that had been building over weeks began to dissolve, replaced by a new emotion. Hope, perhaps, or determination. His mother's strength had always been quiet but unshakable, like the roots of a great tree growing through concrete. Now he could feel that strength flowing into him, straightening his own spine, lifting his chin. Come, Maria said, pulling him into a tight hug. Tomorrow we start fighting back. But tonight we rest. That night, for the first time in weeks, Joao slept deeply and dreamlessly, comforted by the knowledge that he wasn't alone in his struggle anymore. In the next room, Maria sat at her desk long into the night, her surgeon's hands now wielding a pen instead of a scalpel as she documented every incident, every slight, every moment of discrimination her son had endured. Her handwriting remained precise and clear, even as her anger threatened to make it shake. The morning would bring new challenges, new battles to fight. But as the city slept around them, mother and son found peace in the knowledge that they would face whatever came next together. The halls of Colegio Westview might be lined with the names of powerful families, but they had underestimated the power of a mother's love and her determination to protect her child. Anna's response had been immediate and unequivocal. We'll meet at Café Santos at 7 a.m. Bring everything you can remember. This ends now. As Maria finally prepared for bed, she paused at Joao's door, watching her son sleep peacefully for the first time in weeks. She made a silent promise, not just to Joao, but to every child who might follow in his footsteps. This battle would be fought, and it would be won. The city lights continued to twinkle outside their window, and somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, the familiar soundtrack of their neighborhood. But tonight, these sounds carried a different meaning. They were no longer reminders of what separated them from the privileged world of Colegio Westview, but rather a testament to their resilience, their determination to change that world from within. The early morning sun had barely begun to paint the sky when Maria and João arrived at Café Santos. The small establishment, with its worn wooden tables and faded photographs of old Rio de Janeiro on the walls, stood in stark contrast to the polished cafes near Collegio Westview. But it was here, among the aroma of freshly ground coffee and warm pão de queijo, that they would begin planning their resistance. Ana Rodriguez was already waiting for them at a corner table, her laptop open and a stack of legal papers beside her coffee cup. Her sharp business suit seemed out of place among the cafe's regular morning crowd of workers grabbing breakfast before their shifts, but her warm smile as she greeted them belonged perfectly to the humble setting. Maria, she stood to embrace her friend, then turned to João with gentle eyes. And Joe, Ayo, you've grown so much since I last saw you. She gestured to the chairs across from her. Sit, both of you. We have much to discuss. The waiter, an elderly man who had known Maria since her residency days, brought them coffee without being asked. As he set down the steaming cups, he squeezed Maria's shoulder in silent support, having overheard snippets of their conversation over the years about Joao's struggles and triumphs. I've been reviewing similar cases, Ana began, her voice low but intense. What you're describing, Maria, isn't isolated. Over the past 5 years, there have been numerous complaints about discriminatory practices at elite schools across the city. Most were quietly resolved, or rather, buried, with settlements and non-disclosure agreements. Maria's hands tightened around her coffee cup. How many cases specifically involving Collegio Westview? 3 that I could find, all within the last 2 years. Ana pulled out several documents from her stack. 2 involved students from indigenous backgrounds, 1 from a family of Japanese immigrants. All 3 families eventually withdrew their children from the school. João listened silently, his own coffee growing cold before him. Each detail Ana shared painted a clearer picture of a system designed to maintain its exclusivity not just through high fees and academic requirements, but through subtle and not-so-subtle pressure on those deemed outsiders. But here's where your case is different, Ana continued, her eyes sparking with the same fire that had made her one of the city's most formidable civil rights attorneys. You're not just any parent, Maria. You're Dr. Maria Martinez, head of neurosurgery at Central Hospital. Your reputation is impeccable, your credentials unassailable. They can't dismiss you as easily as they did the others. Maria nodded slowly, her surgeon's mind already analyzing the situation like a complicated procedure. We'll need evidence, documentation of every incident. Already started, Anna replied, pulling out another folder. I've drafted a formal complaint letter, but before we submit it, we need to gather more support. Are there other parents you can reach out to? Other students who've experienced similar treatment? João spoke up for the first time since they'd arrived. There's a girl in my class, Luisa. Her parents are from Bolivia. Professor Martins treats her differently too. Not as badly as me, but I've seen the way she ignores her questions, makes little comments about her accent. Ana made a note on her legal pad. Good. We'll need to approach her parents carefully. Many families in these situations stay quiet out of fear of retaliation. I understand their fear, Maria said softly, reaching over to squeeze Joao's hand. But sometimes silence only perpetuates the injustice. The morning crowd at Café Santos had thinned, leaving them largely alone with their plans and papers. Through the window, they could see the city coming to life. Street vendors setting up their carts, office workers hurrying past with briefcases, school children in various uniforms making their way to morning classes. The first step, Ana explained, spreading out several documents, is to build our case methodically. João, I need you to start keeping a detailed journal of every interaction with Professor Martins. Times, dates, witnesses, exact words used if possible. Maria, you'll need to document all communication with the school administration. Maria pulled out her phone, already creating a new folder for emails and recordings. Should we approach the board of directors directly or start with the principal? Neither yet. Anna's smile was calculating. First, we build our network. I want at least 3 other families willing to come forward before we make our move. The school needs to understand that this isn't an isolated complaint they can dismiss. It's a pattern of behavior they can no longer ignore. The strategy session continued. As the morning wore on, Joao listened as his mother and Anna discussed legal precedents, documentation requirements, and potential media strategies. It was strange to hear his daily humiliations transformed into legal terms and potential evidence, but there was also something empowering about it. His personal pain was becoming ammunition for a larger fight. "You should still go to school today," Maria told Joao as they prepared to leave. "Act normally. Don't let them suspect we're planning anything." Joao nodded, though his stomach clenched at the thought of facing Professor Martins again. What if she does something else? "Document it," Anna replied firmly. "Every slight, every comment, every accident, it all builds our case. But be careful. Don't antagonize her. Don't give her any excuse to claim you're being disruptive." Outside Café Santos, the morning had fully bloomed into a bright Sao Paulo day. The three of them stood for a moment on the sidewalk, watching the steady stream of humanity flowing past. Joao couldn't help but notice how different this crowd was from the one he saw each day at Collegio Westview. More diverse, more real somehow, yet no less dignified or worthy. "Remember," Anna said, placing a hand on Joao's shoulder, "you're not just fighting for yourself now. You're fighting for every student who comes after you, every child who deserves a chance at an excellent education without facing discrimination." Maria pulled her son into a tight hug, then stepped back to straighten his uniform tie. "Be brave, meu filho, but also be smart. We're playing a long game now." As Joao walked toward his bus stop, his mother's words echoed in his mind. A long game. He thought about all the students who had left Collegio Westview, unable to bear the weight of prejudice and isolation. He thought about Luisa, who still flinched every time Professor Martins mocked her accent. He thought about future students who might walk through those elegant gates, full of hope and ambition, only to face the same subtle barriers and not-so-subtle humiliations. The familiar bus arrived, but today Joao boarded it with a different energy. The weight of isolation had been replaced by the strength of purpose. His mother and Anna were right. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about justice, about changing a system that had gone unchallenged for too long. Maria watched her son's bus disappear into traffic, then turned to Anna. "What do you really think our chances are?" Anna's expression was determined as she gathered her legal files. "With your reputation, Joao's impeccable academic record, and the evidence we're gathering, better than they might expect. But more importantly, win or lose in legal terms, we're going to force them to confront this issue publicly. Sometimes, Maria, the fight itself is as important as the outcome." Maria nodded, her surgeon's mind already categorizing tasks and strategies like she would for a complex operation. She had spent years in operating rooms, making precise cuts to heal hidden wounds. Now she would use that same precision to help heal a different kind of wound, one that had been festering in the halls of prestigious institutions for far too long. As they parted ways, the morning sun now high in the sky, both women carried with them a sense of purpose that went beyond the immediate case. They were about to challenge not just one teacher's prejudice, but an entire system's quiet acceptance of discrimination. The battle ahead would be difficult, but they were ready. After all, some wounds needed to be opened before they could properly heal. Over the next few weeks, the quiet revolution began to take shape. Maria's dining room table transformed into a war room, covered with documents, statements, and carefully annotated school policies. Each evening, she and Joao would sit together, documenting the day's events with the same precision she used for her surgical notes. Anna's legal pad grew thick with tea. Testimonies as more parents began to come forward, their stories weaving together into a tapestry of systematic discrimination. Luisa's parents were the first to join them. They arrived one evening, carrying their own stack of notebooks where they had documented years of subtle slights and not-so-subtle exclusions. As they shared their experiences over cups of strong coffee, Maria watched the relief wash over their faces, the profound comfort of discovering you're not alone in your struggle. "We always told Luisa to stay strong, to work harder," her father said, his accent thick with emotion. "We thought if she could just prove herself academically, they would have to accept her. But it never seems to be enough. Maria reached across the table to squeeze his hand. It will never be enough for them because the problem isn't with our children. It's with a system that was designed to exclude them. More families followed. A Nigerian father whose son had been consistently overlooked for academic honors despite having the highest grades in his class. A Chinese mother whose daughter had been told her Portuguese would never be quite natural enough for the school's prestigious debate team. Each story added another thread to the narrative they were building, another piece of evidence for the pattern they needed to prove. João watched these gatherings from his usual spot at the corner of the table, taking in the mix of languages and accents that filled their modest apartment. He saw how his mother listened to each family with the same focused attention she gave to her patients. How Anna's legal pad filled with notes, not just about discriminatory actions, but about dreams deferred, confidence shattered, and potential denied. The movement grew beyond their dining room. WhatsApp groups formed, filled with parents sharing resources and support. Older students who had left the school years ago began reaching out, offering their own testimonies. A network of resistance was forming, invisible to the administration of Collegio Westview, but growing stronger by the day. Meanwhile, in the hallways of the school, subtle shifts began to occur. Students whose families had joined the cause started sitting together at lunch, creating their own community within the hostile environment. They shared notes, helped each other with assignments, and most importantly, served as witnesses for each other. Every dismissive comment from Professor Martins, every accidental exclusion from class activities, every biased grade was now being documented by multiple observers. The teacher seemed to sense the change, though she couldn't quite identify its source. Her attempts at humiliation were met with quiet solidarity instead of isolated shame. When she tried to embarrass João during another class demonstration, 3 other students immediately raised their hands to point out that his technique had been correct. The power dynamic was shifting, imperceptibly but inexorably. Maria continued her work at the hospital, her surgical precision never wavering despite the long nights spent building their case. If anything, her resolve in the operating room grew stronger. Each successful surgery was a reminder of what excellence truly meant. Not the superficial markers of privilege that Collegio Westview celebrated, but the real impact one could have on others' lives. Anna worked tirelessly, her legal expertise shaping their collected evidence into a compelling narrative of institutional discrimination. She brought in experts to review the school's policies, uncovering buried clauses and hidden biases that had enabled the systematic exclusion of students who didn't fit the traditional mold. One evening, as they reviewed their growing documentation, Anna looked up from her legal papers with a fierce smile. They won't be able to ignore this. The evidence is too strong, the pattern too clear. But more importantly, the families are ready to stand together. No more quiet settling. NTS, no more children withdrawn in shame. Maria nodded, thinking of all the nights she'd heard João crying quietly in his room, trying to hide his pain. When do we move? Next week, Anna replied, shuffling through her calendar. The board has its monthly meeting on Thursday. We'll present our findings then. I've already contacted several education reporters who are interested in the story. The news spread through their network like electricity through a circuit. Parents began preparing their statements, students gathered their documentation, and former alumni drafted letters of support. The revolution they had planned in whispers was about to break into the open. The night before the board meeting, Maria found João sitting at his desk, staring at his biology textbook without really seeing it. She sat beside him, noting how much older he looked than he had just months ago when he'd first received his acceptance letter to Collegio Westview. Are you ready for tomorrow? She asked softly. João closed his book, turning to face her. I'm scared, he admitted. Not just for me, but for everyone. What if they don't listen? What if they find a way to punish all of us? Maria took his hands in hers, noticing how they had grown to nearly match her own. Meu filho, being scared doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. But remember what I've always told you about surgery. That the hardest cuts are sometimes the most necessary ones. Exactly. She smiled, seeing in him the same strength she had discovered in herself years ago when she'd first decided to become a surgeon despite all the voices telling her it wasn't a place for someone like her. Tomorrow, we make the necessary cut. And like any good surgery, we won't do it alone. We'll have a whole team supporting us. That night, across the city, dozens of families prepared for the next day's confrontation. Documents were organized, speeches were practiced, and children were held close. In her office, Anna made final revisions to their presentation, ensuring every claim was backed by solid evidence. In their homes, reporters began drafting the outlines of stories that would soon break across the city's headlines. And in the Martinez apartment, mother and son sat together at their dining room table, surrounded by the papers and plans that represented their fight for justice. They didn't need to speak. Their shared purpose filled the room with a quiet energy, a determination that had grown from personal pain into something larger and more powerful. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own battles. But tonight, they found strength in the knowledge that they were no longer fighting alone. The walls of privilege that had seemed so impenetrable when João first walked through the gates of Colégio Westview were about to face their greatest test. Not from a single family demanding justice, but from a community united in their demand for change. As the city lights twinkled outside their window, Maria and João shared a look of understanding. Whatever happened tomorrow, they had already achieved something remarkable. They had transformed isolation into unity, fear into determination, and silent suffering into collective action. The real victory wasn't just in challenging the system. It was in proving that no one had to face that challenge alone.